Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, local responders have limited preparation for a worst case scenario, a cloud of toxic gas that threatens their community. We now continue with Part 1, Chapter 5, Alarm. Epigraph. One of the finest things men and women do is rescue men and women. Norman McLean. Thursday, April 11, Day 1. Graveyard shift was quiet time. At the 911 Emergency Center in the basement of the Missoula County Courthouse, Senior Dispatcher Katie Driggers took the first Alberton call from MRL at 4:19 a.m. She spun round her chair declaring, "Well, here's your call, girls. This will keep us busy for a while." After that, all hell broke loose, Dale Golden recalled. She no sooner got those words out of her mouth when every single line on the 911 bank rang. 12 lights. Driggers, Golden, and Becky Bloom faced a pressure cooker ready to burst. MRL dispatcher Carter Meyer earlier confused B.J. McComb's instructions, failing to consult a map. Now, MRL's Ray Hoff told Driggers the spill site was just west of Alberton, but requested an ambulance to the Petty Creek exit for the engineers still stranded 4 miles west of Petty Creek. Hoff muddled everything by giving directions for responders to cross the river, cross the tracks, and then hang a right, he said. There should be a train down toward the west end. I think we got a chlorine spill. McComb's directions regarding the Natural Pier Bridge were now wedded to Petty Creek Bridge in the minds of 911. Driggers passed the misinformation to the Alberton Volunteer Fire Department, relaying a chlorine spill located at the Petty Creek exit across the river. The trains at the west end of the tracks obviously derailed. Hoff advised chlorine was a, quote, very poisonous gas, and Driggers wrote, sounds like crew members are coughing due to exposure. Golden called Hoff right back for more information. Hoff guessed they are probably west of that Bible camp. The Northwest Indian Bible School, south of the river, lay opposite the east end of Alberton, over 3 miles from the spill site. 911 noted an unknown number of cars derailed, an unknown volume of chlorine spilled, an unknown size of the gas cloud, and a green mist on the ground. The Mineral and Missoula County line doglegged through the area. Though the spill was incorrectly believed to be in Missoula County, 911 paged Alberton Fire volunteers to Petty Creek. Alberton Fire then had 911 also dispatch Frenchtown Rural Fire Station 5, located just half a mile east of Petty Creek. Regardless, chlorine gas knew no boundaries. Frenchtown Fire was also volunteer, except for Chief Scott Waldron. At 4:27 a.m., Waldron mobilized from his home north of Huson to the east. 911 also contacted the Mineral and Missoula County Sheriff's offices. Deputy Willis Hintz, patrol sergeant for the Missoula Graveyard Shift, asked 911 to send the whole shift to help with expected evacuations, and to call Missoula Regional Hazmat and notify disaster emergency services. Protecting people and controlling access was on Hintz's mind, but as he hurried toward Petty Creek, he also anticipated finding out where the spill was, in the dark. His only hazmat gear was a cartridge filter mask used for escape. Driggers then paged the Missoula Rural Fire Department and deputies to Petty Creek, saying the train was west of Bible Lane. I don't have the exact location, she said. Deputy Roy Van Wormer, already at Huson about 10 miles east, wanted one. I just don't want to drive into it, he said. Hintz told Van Wormer to set up in a safe area and that he was on his way. Meanwhile, volunteer firefighter Terry Fairbanks said that when her crew left Alberton, the gas had not yet arrived. Everyone converged on Petty Creek, over 4 miles east of the spill. 911 was swamped. We got the initial crews going, but there were 3 of us with 12 lines ringing, and we had to triage those calls, Golden recalled. We would hang up on a 911 call, and that line would ring again, and that went on for up to about 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning. Most callers were not getting through. While answering the barrage, the dispatchers also contacted responders and monitored radio traffic. In 1996, responders generally had no mobile phones, so 911 had to relay some information. The mass confusion was just undescribable listening to those 911 tapes, Terry Fairbanks recalled. Dispatchers also wrote brief call for service notes. sharing key comments on their computer screen with each other. The dispatcher had to be adept at listening and typing at the same time while often reading. 911 had to be wizards of multitasking. You know, it sounds crazy, Golden allowed. This was the number one emergency they'd ever responded to. But a realistic definition of multitasking is doing many things at once with mediocrity. Golden admitted, "We didn't get the exact location until those guys were on the scene. But the thing that was not in question at any time during that morning was the general location." But the believed general location was off by 2 or more miles. No dispatcher ever requested or referenced a mile marker for the spill site. Confusion would soon multiply, as 911 was also unfamiliar with the locale. While responders mustered to Petty Creek, gas swamped homes 4 miles west. At 4:22 a.m., Darla Rohrbach of Plateau Road reported to 911 that her house had shook and, quote, smoke was everywhere. Map confirming Rohrbach's location would have nailed the spill location. Over 400 people lived in the 4 miles downwind. Driggers assured Rohrbach there are people responding right now, though no one was responding to Rohrbach's area. Minutes later, Steve Rohrbach told Driggers of a green mist on the ground, and my lungs started freaking out. We're evacuating the house right now. Should I contact my neighbors? Official evacuations had not yet begun. Neither county had a reverse 911 emergency notification system. Residents would have to be notified by authorities in person or by relatives and neighbors or possibly through the media. Driggers radioed Deputy Hintz, who said, "Tell them to leave." Hintz instructed Driggers to tell all responding deputies to start evacuations once they arrived at Petty Creek. 911 had the okay to advise evacuations, but didn't understand where the spill was. By 4:30 a.m., both sheriff's offices started planning for evacuations, calling for a command post to be set up and notification of the Red Cross. But there was no prepared plan to implement for the Alberton area, and no clear understanding yet where to evacuate to. Dispatchers also needed to understand the nature of the threat. MRL's Hoff had told Driggers that chlorine was very poisonous. Dispatchers had a copy of the DOT Emergency Handbook, and at 4:20 a.m., 911 first broadcast hazmat information on chlorine for the deputies, saying, "This gas has possible health hazards. Contact to skin and eyes may cause burns. The vapors could be irritating." But 911 made no specific mention of chlorine gas being potentially life-threatening or lethal. At 4:28 a.m., as another concerned caller on Plateau Road was told by 911's Driggers to evacuate, Driggers volunteered, "I'll go ahead and tell you it's a chlorine leak, and I don't know what that entails, but just go ahead and leave the area." At 4:31 a.m., MRL's Hoff now requested from 911's Bloom that the ambulance for the train crew be sent instead to the Natural Pier Bridge and the nearest rail crossing. But 911 dispatchers continued to tell other responders to take the Petty Creek exit to find the derailment, quote, just to the right. Ironically, minutes later, the engineers made their successful break to freedom, and the ambulance would indeed be needed at Petty Creek. At 4:35 a.m., as authorities considered closing I-90, Deputy Hintz, still en route, underlined the imperative. "I've got to find out where the wreck is at exactly so we can start setting up and getting things diverted." At 4:37 a.m., 911 received a call from a resident who had heard the derailment and reported something very nasty that we're breathing. He said he lived across from the Natural Pier Bridge. 911's Bloom. That's exactly where it has occurred. Bloom, at this point, was the only dispatcher who referenced the spill location as being near the Natural Pier Bridge. But Bloom apparently thought the Natural Pier Bridge was at Petty Creek, saying help was on the way. While Bloom never mentioned chlorine, she advised the caller to keep house windows closed. Caller, so you don't know what it is? 911, we're not positive of what it is yet. While residents were kept poorly informed, the toxic gas cloud expanded by the minute. Confusion compounded when Golden called the National Weather Service to get wind direction for deputies. Understanding movement of the gas was critical. Golden offered her muddled misinformation on the spill location, and then the Weather Service added more by telling her winds would be coming east up through the valley, I guess. Golden, so that would be coming from the east to west? National Weather Service, yes. But winds from the east would be moving downriver. 911 began broadcasting that any wind should be coming from east to west up through the valley. This was nonsense. Golden later emphasized, "We don't interpret information, we record information." Regardless, gas was clearly moving eastward and had also spread north across the narrow canyon, as highway travelers had discovered. At 4:37 a.m., a Missoula ambulance informed 911's Driggers that we need to make sure that all of these responders that are going to this hazmat incident be aware that it's a very toxic event and not to get any closer than they absolutely have to. As Missoula deputies hurried to the assumed general location of the derailment unprotected, Mineral County Deputy Jeff Wilson was likewise advised to respond to Petty Creek, which would send him through the cloud. At 4:40 a.m., per MRL, Driggers redirected Mineral County to send its Superior ambulance to Petty Creek, through the cloud. Initially, Golden said, people were calling wanting to know, should we evacuate? Which way should we go? Should we go east? Should we go west? We couldn't tell them. We didn't know. And our fear, I remember my fear specifically was, if I tell them to go east and that cloud is going east, they're going to go right into it, and that's going to put people at risk. And that was a worry to all three of us. At 4:40 a.m., Missoula Rural Fire advised 911 that people on the west side will go further west and those on the east side to go east towards Missoula. But west or east of where? At 4:47 a.m., an Alberton resident called 911 and was told this vague advice. Caller, well, we're right in town. Driggers, okay, well, whichever way, as long as you can kind of evacuate the general vicinity there. Evacuating to the west would have led the caller toward the spill. The spill was 42 minutes old and the cloud overtaking Alberton. Quickly engulfed by gas, residents on Plateau Road self-evacuated. Sylvia Bookout lived about a quarter-mile east and uphill of the spill site. Bookout, in her early 60s, was in bed when the derailment shook drywall screws out of her ceiling. She heard the sound of grinding metal, successive crashes, and thought it an earthquake. She soon smelled something like hot aluminum and began to worry that a car had been hit by a train. As she drove out to investigate, she noted a greenish fog moving up her driveway, then sort of huddling, she thought. Bookout went down Reardon Lane, almost to the crossing. I rolled the window down, she said, and then, of course, instantly, the oxygen was replaced. When the engineer flashed his lights at her, she managed to drive home, though with difficulty breathing and seeing. Her daughter Kelly confirmed with 911 that this was a chlorine spill, and Bookout evacuated quickly with her family. At a Missoula hospital, Bookout received oxygen and nebulized albuterol for her wheezing and was released. No one decontaminated her. I wore the same clothes for probably 2 days, she said. Lack of decontamination became a common refrain. After B.J. McComb witnessed the gas pushing across the deck of the Natural Pier Bridge, he called his son, who lived just below him on Plateau Road, about 1.5 miles west of the derailment, asking him to help evacuate their neighbors. Kurt McComb, mid-30s, grabbed a wet rag for his face and drove to some of the dozen or so houses spread along Plateau. Back home, he helped evacuate relatives and a house guest who told McComb he smelled like a bug bomb, though all McComb noticed then was a chlorine smell. They felt no hurry because McComb's end of Plateau seemed clear of gas, but unfortunately, Plateau was a dead end, so the caravan evacuated toward the spill site. McComb's car already reeked. With dawn approaching, McComb saw gas spewing from the wreckage. He headed west on I-90 to Superior instead of going to Frenchtown, reasoning that the gas cloud had gone east. McComb developed searing pain in his lungs. In Superior, he went to the emergency room and credited MRL's Gordon Hendricks with enforcing a full decontamination protocol. However, only about 14 people evacuated to Superior Hospital on April 11. By the end of the day, McComb had difficulty breathing. Joan and Orvin Crowder, in their 50s, lived at the first property east of the Natural Pier Bridge. The derailment shook their trailer house. They credited B.J. McComb with alerting them. He says, "Well, look out here. You can see the cloud coming," Joan recalled. They called relatives to warn them. By that time, it was here and it was just getting really bad, she said. You would go outside and it would knock you down. A terrible smell. You couldn't breathe. The cloud rose high above the trees, reflected in the traffic light from I-90. It just filled the whole sky, the whole area, she said. As they evacuated, The Crowders heard train engines roar by across the river, the engineers making their escape. The Crowders went straight to their daughter's house in Missoula. We really stunk, Jones said. She backed off from us because it really got to her, so she took our clothes and washed them. They also showered. Rachel Harley verified her parents reeked. I had to wash my dad's and mom's clothes about 3 times before I could even get the smell out. Harley struggled to describe the overpowering odor. It smelled like chlorine, like an acid smell, like a medicine-like smell. Gary Weber lived on South Frontage Road, close to the western edge of Alberton, almost 2 miles from the spill. At 4:36 a.m., he received early warning of the spill from a neighbor who had been notified by B.J. McComb. Weber's daughter was asleep in the basement, where he said it already smelled like a swimming pool. They grabbed their pets and left quickly. Once we stepped out the door, he said, we were in strong chlorine. It was your eyes watering, gagging, coughing. The gas was invisible in the dark. Based on Weber's account, the gas was at the western edge of Alberton by about 4:40 a.m., near the time when the Alberton Volunteer Fire Department pointlessly arrived at Petty Creek. Frenchtown Fire volunteers Steve Franklin and Paul Manson lived east of Petty Creek, separated by the Clark Fork River, Manson on the west end of Ponderosa Acres and Franklin on Southside Road. On call-outs, they usually met up at the Petty Creek Bridge after Manson grabbed an engine from Station 5. 911 said the spill was at Petty Creek, and Scott Waldron radioed local volunteers to muster at Station 5. Franklin didn't drive fast. He had no respiratory gear. I was coming down the road with the window open, because in training, chlorine is like bad stuff. I was coming down fairly slow because I had my head out the window. A nose-lung monitor. Approaching the assumed spill site downwind without protection, Franklin had great reason to be cautious, and later feel lucky. Why respond toward a chemical gas leak without proper protection? Because Waldron ordered them to meet at Station 5, the men said. Only as he approached Petty Creek did Franklin hear 911 update that the spill was somewhere west of Alberton and not near the bridge. I breathed a little easier, he said. I didn't smell anything the whole time coming down. Manson, we didn't really know where it was. Meanwhile, as Manson left home, he warned his wife and kids. Unfortunately, his family would have to evacuate west 1 mile to access the highway into any oncoming gas cloud. After arriving at Station 5, Manson switched into a fire engine, planning to meet Franklin at the bridge, having missed Waldron's order to meet at Station 5. As he drove the engine the half-mile to Petty Creek, Manson passed en route a perplexed Franklin who was almost to the station and sandwiched between 2 Alberton fire trucks. Manson, nobody really knew what the hell was going on. Manson arrived at Petty Creek Bridge around 4:30 a.m., while Franklin arrived at Station 5. Franklin said a big rescue rig out of Frenchtown Station 1 also arrived with 2 hazmat crewmen. Additionally, Linda and Pat Walsh, Frenchtown Station 4 volunteers who lived up the 9 Mile Valley, were also en route. As responders converged near Petty Creek, 911's Driggers warned, "This is an extremely toxic situation. If you could remain as far from the area as you are able to due to the chlorine gas." A mixed message, but responders at Station 5 had no idea they were almost 5 miles from the spill site. They said the spill was at Petty Creek and there was nothing there, Manson recalled. At the bridge, he met volunteer Clay Ishler arriving from Southside Road. They soon heard the spill was just west of Alberton. I picked up Ishler over there and told him to BA up because we're going to start racking on doors. Manson had SCBA in the truck, self-contained breathing apparatus. No one ever told us how to drive with these things on. They drove Bible Lane, planning to evacuate first the Northwest Indian Bible School at the end of the road 1 mile west. Our thought was to get as close to the spill as we could and work our way back, he said. When Manson and Ishler got to the school, some kids and teachers already stood outside in a big group, and you could smell chlorine a little bit, like bleach, Manson said. They asked, "Where do we go? Where do we go?" And we didn't really know where the train derailment was. I said, "Go to Missoula." That was far enough. Manson never saw the gas on April 11, but it was dark and foggy and drizzling. But he smelled chlorine when he didn't have his mask on. The air became pretty heavily charged, he said. It was all over this place. It was like somebody mopped their floor in Clorox. Chlorine is a heavy gas. It stays down low, and in theory it should have flowed down the river. But it didn't. It went up, because there was so much. It did fill the valleys up, he said. The Alberton fire sirens soon howled north of the river, which helped because Manson's engine siren quit by the time they got to the school. They flashed their lights as they canvassed back east. There was not really no county evacuation plan set up, Manson said. You just get the hell out of there. And some people wanted to go that way to the west, which would have drove them right by it. Go to Missoula, he said. Get on the highway. Go. Just leave. They hot-changed oxygen bottles during the evacuation as fast as possible. You're banging on the door real early in the morning, and you got these things on, the SCBA, and you look like Darth Vader, and people are just screaming and slamming the door in your face. Go! Near Petty Creek, many homes clustered in the old Lothrop Station area. It was like ants at a party, Manson said. Everybody was running every way. It was just mass confusion. Like ants at a fumigation. The Northwest Indian Bible School's mission was to help educate Indian teenagers, essentially a Christian boarding school for Native American students sponsored by the Wesleyan Methodist Church. The school had about 25 students in 1996 and about half as many staff. The school was just over 3 miles east of the spill. Teacher Thomas Jerry Wakeman and his wife Rebecca and 4 children lived on the compound nestled between the mountainside and the Clark Fork River. Around 5 a.m., he was woken by a volunteer fireman pounding on his door, crying, "You've got to get out of here." Then I could smell it, Wakeman said. Wakeman worried for his wife, a liver transplant patient who was not supposed to be exposed to chemicals. Following his family, Wakeman said, I went out to the car and they said our dog was still in the house, so I went back in to get her. And at that time I started to experience burning in my lungs. And then I needed to get something else, so I ran back in the 3rd time. And it was at that time I almost didn't make it back to the car. My eyes were burning, my lungs were burning. I just didn't know what was going on. I didn't realize at that time it was chlorine. I almost started passing out. I couldn't breathe. With the help of a wet rag over his mouth, Wakeman drove to the highway and followed a line of cars to Frenchtown. Manson and Ishler had 8 oxygen tanks in their truck, about 30 minutes per tank, and began to conserve as they ran low. As they finished evacuating Bible Lane, Waldron ordered them to 9 Mile Hill, where a new command post had been set up. Manson said he and Ishler didn't decontaminate at 9 Mile, explaining, I didn't think I needed to. It was a gas, not a liquid. His son, Pat, a volunteer still in high school, was trained as a basic hazmat technician. He set up their decon area, he said, and you've got a kid telling adults that didn't know anything about it. Manson implied that responders weren't interested in decontamination, including himself. Manson recalled no symptoms that morning, other than my eyes being burned, he said. The embattled engineers arrived at Petty Creek around 4:45 a.m. Station 5 volunteer Mitchell Hicks said he was the first to encounter them after their ordeal. Hicks lived over 7 miles up Petty Creek and arrived in an ambulance he stationed at his house. Like Franklin, Hicks responded without protection to what he believed was a chlorine spill at Petty Creek. All of a sudden you really got a strong whiff of chlorine, he said. We saw the big chlorine cloud coming up the tracks. It was holding pretty low, I'd say 20 feet maybe, 25 feet, some over the river and coming down the tracks. The gas was really strong, he said, because it irritated my throat, my sinuses, and my eyes especially started watering. Ambulances carried no SCBA. When I saw the cloud, I said, I'm getting out of here. And Hicks recalled the engineer saying the same. Hicks told Caswell, I'm going to start evacuating. Caswell and Shutter, however, were in no shape to drive on and were awaiting an ambulance. Hicks, an EMT with an ambulance, didn't seem to recall this. The engineers would wait while the chlorine they had escaped caught up to them. Hicks evacuated several homes, thinking he could weather the exposure unprotected, but ultimately, he recalled, I think I did go up Petty Creek to get out of that chlorine. After his short evacuation, he set up a roadblock a few miles up. Paged at 4:23 a.m., Frenchtown Chief Scott Waldron recalled arriving at Petty Creek within probably 20 minutes, he said. As he drove out, Waldron said, they advised me at Station 5 initially that there was just a very slight smell of chlorine, nothing that was excessive. En route, I was making sure I knew where people were. I knew what we were dealing with, making sure everybody was safe, not getting into a cloud they couldn't deal with. But Walden understood he was responding to an expanding gas cloud, and initially he was told the spill was near Petty Creek. Responders were arriving without wearing, and some not having, SCBA. When Walden arrived at Petty Creek, he said, "You could smell it a little bit, just like a laundry room kind of smell, when you first got there." Walden found the engineers at the crossing. "I got the manifest waybills from them and started doing business." Did Walden verify the spill location? Walden said the engineers told us about where the derailment was, but I didn't place a whole bunch of relevance on where the train was. It wouldn't have mattered if the train derailment was 100 miles away. We were dealing with where the cloud was and what evacuations needed to take place. Because in the dark, all we were able to go by was our nose. There wasn't much else to go by, so we started pushing people out of the canyons. The smell of chlorine at Petty Creek was slight, he said, and so we knew it was west of us. From the engineers, Walden should have clearly understood the derailment was 4 miles to the west. Knowing where the derailment was mattered very much because the chlorine would be at a higher concentration closer to the site, at least initially, and because there would likely be an ongoing release. The residents closest to the spill were at greatest risk, and responders needed to know the exact location as they led evacuations. Anyone approaching closer to the site without SCBA using their nose would have risked serious exposure. There was no documentation or indication that Walden passed on to 911 or to Missoula Hazmat information from the engineers about the spill location. As everyone converged at the Petty Creek Bridge, Alberton firefighter Terry Fairbanks recalled B.J. McComb pulling off the interstate and shouting that chlorine gas was on its way. And then we were informed by the engineers, Alberton Fire Chief Tim Ishler said, that the derailment was actually a natural pier bridge. Almost 40 minutes into the spill, having talked to the engineers in Macomb, responders at Petty Creek finally understood the location of the derailment and that chlorine gas threatened Alberton. Another reason why it mattered, knowing the spill location. At 4:46 a.m., 911's Golden advised that Frenchtown Fire had moved Alberton to evacuate. The Alberton fire crew about-faced and arrived back in Alberton around 4:50 a.m., where Ishler said it had now become obviously foggy from the gas cloud. A minute later, Ishler confirmed to 911, "We're going to have to evacuate." By now, the gas had had 44 minutes to travel over 2 miles and into the heart of Alberton, an easy walking speed. With Alberton fire pages coming at 4:21 a.m., a warning siren could have started within minutes. An Alberton resident reported hearing the first fire hall alarm shortly before 5 a.m. By then, the gas cloud had swamped the town. If the spill had actually been somewhere just west of Alberton, as 911 was updated by MRL, Alberton would have been threatened almost immediately by the gas. MRL's information should have triggered a warning or evacuation of Alberton. But responders did not understand the behavior of chlorine gas. When they initially believed the spill had occurred close to Petty Creek, the expansion and movement of a chlorine gas cloud had not been anticipated, because the Petty Creek area had not immediately been called for evacuation either. Furthermore, no one should have responded to the general area of a chlorine spill without respiratory protection. Knowing where the spill was mattered, as did realizing the significance of chlorine toxicity and gas cloud behavior. At 5:01 a.m., Ray Hoff of MRL called 911 again to report that some MRL employees living in Alberton said they walked out the door and they could smell chlorine. Hoff advised what we show here not to breathe it, and he suggested they probably better stay inside. Hoff was surprised to hear from 911 that an Alberton evacuation had started. The MRL point man for communications to 911 about the spill had not anticipated gas movement and protective action. MRL was not alone in not fully understanding the threat. An official call for evacuation was supposed to trigger a protocol for alerting the public and passing on key information, a means alert. The Missoula Emergency All Notification System helps notify the public via the media, but a means alert would not be broadcast until 5:28 a.m. Meanwhile, at 4:49 a.m., Walden advised 911 that a forward command post was being set up at Station 5, half a mile east of Petty Creek. He asked that deputies in Missoula Hazmat report there. This plan would send more responders to Petty Creek, including deputies without SCBA, into an advancing chlorine cloud and into a dead-end area also planned for evacuation. Very quickly, a Station 5 command was proven short-sighted, and Waldron would be evacuating himself. Man, it was a dark and stormy night, Deputy Willis Hintz recalled, with scant irony. The heavy rain had caused a creek west of Missoula to flood earlier that night, the main concern of his shift until now. As Hintz drove from Missoula, he advised other officers not to drive into the cloud. Yet it was dark, no one had a meter, and no one knew exactly where the spill was, and deputies arrived on scene without any SCBA. Paul Manson said of the deputies, "We kind of referred to them as blue canaries. Well, they didn't have any protective suits or anything on, and they were charging. They meant well, but nobody really knew what the hell was going on. It was an unknown." Deputy Van Wormer arrived at Petty Creek exit at the same time as Waldron. As Hintz flew down I-90, Deputy Dave Waldrod radioed from the 9-mile exit of I-90 at 4:49 a.m., wanting to know if he should set up a roadblock. Hintz told Waldrod not to close the road, but to stop and advise people of the situation and of the possible effects. Deputy Waldrod said he stopped several cars, and they continued westbound after they were advised of the hazards. And so Hintz allowed drivers to drive toward the gas cloud, not yet understanding the highway was at risk with the lateral spread of the gas cloud. Hintz arrived about 4:50 a.m. and found Deputy Van Wormer had set up a local roadblock at the Petty Creek Bridge, with Frenchtown Fire set up on the south side of the bridge. Hintz: "I got out of the car and smelled a strong odor of chlorine. About 10 seconds after my arrival, Officer Jeff Wilson from the Mineral County Sheriff's Office arrived. He said he drove through the cloud on the interstate. En route, Wilson had reported a very strong gas smell." Hintz now had Deputy Waldrod shut down the interstate at 9-mile exit. It would take more time to control frontage and local access to I-90. On the west side, at 4:58 a.m., the Superior ambulance en route to Petty Creek stopped at Fish Creek, over 7 miles from the spill site. The Mineral County Sheriff's Office told 911 that they weren't going to go any further. The chlorine gas is really strong there. The ambulance remained at the exit to block eastbound traffic, effectively closing I-90 from the west end. The I-90 closures were not anticipated, despite the close proximity of the highway to the railroad. The deputies knew nothing of the travails of the drivers on I-90, which had been unfolding for about half an hour, or that the gas had reached Alberton, just north of I-90. Meanwhile, gas was also moving west at a fast rate, over 7 miles per hour to have reached Fish Creek in about 50 minutes. This was explained by any gas that floated across the river, the lowest point around, becoming entrained in the downriver air currents. No word of evacuations west of the spill outside of Plateau Road would come on this day. When Hintz arrived at Petty Creek, he met up with Chief Waldron and Engineer Caswell at the track crossing. Hintz said Caswell was bent over like he was going to vomit, but refused to leave for medical treatment until they had turned over all the bills of lading, so we knew exactly what was on that train. They worried about the community first. By choice or not, the engineers were left waiting for transport. Hicks had left with his ambulance. Hintz called 911 around 4:56 a.m., asking for an ambulance, and 2 minutes later, the Mineral County ambulance already en route reported they'd stopped at Fish Creek because of the gas. McComb was now prepared to take the engineers in his truck, but Franklin then arrived back at Petty Creek from Fire Station 5. Franklin left for Frenchtown with the engineers at 5:10 a.m. Caswell and Shutter spent about 30 minutes waiting for medical rescue in an area reached by the chlorine cloud, despite 2 Station 5 ambulances being available. The initial plan, apparently, was to ambulance the engineers to Superior, through the main cloud. A Missoula ambulance had not been dispatched. After Hintz arrived, he and Waldron had a 5 or 10 minute tete-a-tete on the bridge. Hintz was built like a bulldog with a friendly gap-toothed smile. The mustachioed Waldron, about 50, was balding and overweight, wearing large pilot wire-rimmed glasses. Hintz said he and Waldron decided Scott Waldron was going to be the incident commander, because he was better qualified than me, Hintz said. And 2, his people had a lot more protective gear than my deputies did. Waldron and Hintz agreed that firefighters would handle west of Petty Creek, where the gas was heavier, and deputies would go east as far as the 9 Mile exit. Hince would work with Deputy Van Wormer. He also asked 911 to page search and rescue personnel. Protected or not, the deputies felt duty-bound to help. Hince and Van Wormer began evacuations around 5 a.m. Alberton firefighters had left to evacuate their town and would also evacuate some areas west of Alberton. Altogether, responders covered the area from up Plateau Road to the 9 Mile exit, 10 miles, about 9 miles to the east. A plan was made to send evacuees to Frenchtown High School. Responders usually referred to the DOT handbook, but Hince said they did not rely on it. We knew the derailment was not in the initial area, Petty Creek, and the roadblock was picked at 9 Mile as that was the closest exit that was not in the spill area that we could control. The problem Scott and I had with setting up the parameters was that we didn't know how big the problem was. We knew that a chlorine tank had ruptured. We didn't know how many tank cars ruptured and if there were other chemicals. So I think the initial decision on the evacuation was, well, it sounds good to me. I don't think Scott and I really knew the extent of the problem. So we acted in good faith, knowing that it would be better to evacuate too much than not enough. The spur-of-the-moment decision on evacuation distance was considered safe for now. Arriving at the wrong place initially was arguably fortuitous for responders. If the spill had been close to Petty Creek, or if the initial responders had been sent to the Natural Pier Bridge area, they would have likely arrived within a major gas cloud, and anyone not using protection put at great risk. MRL's and 911's bad information did anyone arriving at Petty Creek without SCBA an unintended favor. This pointed out, though, that responders didn't really understand what they were getting into. However, the misinformation did affect the pattern and timing of evacuations, and wasted time for the volunteer firemen who evacuated Alberton. At 5:05 a.m., an Alberton resident called 911's Bloom, asking if there was a big fire in Alberton. The Alberton fire signal has been going off for many minutes, he said. Bloom quickly explained about the spill, now almost an hour old. The town of Alberton is evacuating. Next time on Gassed, the true story of a toxic train derailment. A cloud of toxic gas overcomes the town of Alberton, Montana. Till then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.